Did you ever wonder what student life was truly like in the medieval ages? Forget your cozy dorms and late-night study sessions. Picture a world where new students were treated like beasts, where debates could turn into brutal brawls, and where a good party often ended in a riot. From the 12th to the 15th centuries, university campuses were hotbeds of intellect and chaos, and they had some truly bizarre ways of doing things. Get ready to dive into 6 of the weirdest rituals that shaped the lives of medieval scholars. Number 1. The punishment ceremony. The public shame and expulsion. Imagine the hushed tension in a medieval university courtyard. A gathering of cloaked masters, stern-faced rectors, and a throng of students, all eyes fixed on a lone figure in the center. This was no ordinary assembly. This was a medieval punishment ceremony, often culminating in the ultimate humiliation: public expulsion. Universities in the Middle Ages were not just places of learning. They were powerful, self-governing entities, possessing their own laws, their own courts, and their own methods of justice, often independent of the local civil authorities. A student's life was entirely governed by the university's statutes, and breaking these rules could lead to a truly memorable and deeply mortifying experience. The process usually began with an accusation. Perhaps a student had been caught engaging in academic fraud, like plagiarizing a master's work or tampering with examination papers. Maybe they were involved in a violent brawl with townspeople, an all-too-common occurrence in the town gown clashes that plagued university towns like Oxford or Paris. Sometimes, the transgression was less dramatic but still serious in the eyes of the authorities. Chronic absenteeism, habitual gambling, or living a life deemed too riotous, too extravagant, or too scandalous for a scholar. Charges would be brought before the university's internal court, often presided over by the rector or chancellor, sometimes with the assistance of a council of masters. The accused student would be called to stand before this learned body to answer for their alleged misdeeds. The atmosphere in these courtrooms, often a simple room within a college or a university building, was always heavy with the weight of academic authority. There was no appeal to external powers. The university was sovereign in its domain. The trial itself, depending on the severity of the charge, could be swift or drawn out. Witnesses often, fellow students or even local townspeople, might be called to give testimony. The student would have the opportunity to confess or deny the accusations. For minor infractions, the punishment might be a hefty fine, a period of temporary suspension from lectures, or even a few lashes administered within the confines of the college walls. These were uncomfortable experiences, to be sure, but they lacked the public spectacle of the more severe penalties. However, for grave offenses, repeated violence, serious theft, heresy, or a flagrant, unrepentant disregard for university rules, the ultimate sentence loomed: expulsion. Expulsion was not merely being told to leave. It was a deeply ritualized act of public shaming and banishment, designed to serve as a stark warning to all who witnessed. Imagine the condemned student, perhaps forced to wear a rough, ill-fitting garment instead of their scholarly gown, or perhaps even having their own gown torn from them in a symbolic act of stripping away their academic identity. They might be paraded through the university grounds or the main streets of the town, escorted by university beadles or proctors, the very men responsible for enforcing the university's discipline. The route would often pass by the major lecture halls, the college gates, and other prominent university landmarks, ensuring maximum visibility for the onlookers. As the procession moved, a university official, often the rector or chancellor, would publicly read out the decree of expulsion. This was no quiet, whispered announcement. It was a formal, booming pronouncement, often in Latin, detailing the student's name, their crime, and the severe consequences of their actions. The words would hang in the air, a chilling reminder of the university's power. The decree might explicitly state that the student was not only expelled from this university, but was also forbidden from attending any other university, effectively ending their academic career forever. This banishment was a heavy blow in a society where intellectual pursuits were a path to power and prestige. For a young man who had invested years and often significant family resources into his studies, this ritual marked the complete ruin of his future prospects. Sometimes, the ceremony included even more symbolic acts of degradation. In some instances, the student's academic books or notes might be burned publicly, symbolizing the erasure of their intellectual contributions and their right to scholarship. Accounts from various universities, like those of Paris or Bologna, describe how these ceremonies were meticulously planned to impress upon the entire student body the gravity of the offense and the unyielding authority of the university. The silence of the crowd, broken only by the officials' pronouncements and perhaps the occasional murmuring of students, added to the grim atmosphere. The students watching understood the message clearly. This could be any one of them if they strayed from the path of scholarly conduct. Once the pronouncement was made, the student would be physically escorted out of the university gates, symbolically cast out from the academic community. They might be forbidden from ever returning to the town, or at least from living within its university district. The gate clanged shut behind them, severing their ties. This public expulsion served multiple purposes for the medieval university. It maintained strict discipline within a sometimes unruly student body, particularly in towns where students often outnumbered local citizens and contributed to social unrest. It upheld the reputation of the university as a serious institution, dedicated to learning and moral conduct. And it demonstrated the university's unique legal autonomy, its ability to govern its own affairs without external interference. The memory of such a ceremony, whether witnessed or merely heard about, would linger for years, a dark testament to the stern justice of medieval academic life. Number 2. The master's mocking when students fought back. Medieval university life was not always about quiet study and respectful deference to authority. While students generally upheld a certain level of respect for their masters, there were significant instances where this dynamic shifted dramatically. Students, especially when acting collectively, sometimes engaged in acts of defiance, pranks, and even organized rebellion against their professors and the broader university administration. These weren't always formal rituals, but they often followed patterns, becoming almost a counter-ritual, a way for the student body to express its power and push back against unwelcome policies or unpopular masters. Consider the dynamic. Masters held immense power, delivering lectures in Latin, assigning texts, and overseeing disputations. Their word was often law in the classroom. However, students also held a unique form of power. Their numbers, universities thrived on the fees paid by students, and their collective presence represented a significant economic force in the towns they inhabited. This gave students, especially when organized into nations or other internal factions, a surprising degree of leverage. When grievances mounted, or when a master was particularly disliked, students found creative and sometimes disruptive ways to fight back. One common, though perhaps less dramatic form of mockery was the organized disruption of lectures. Imagine a notoriously dull or overly strict master attempting to deliver a complex lecture on logic or theology. Instead of rapt attention, students might begin to subtly cough, shuffle their feet, or drop their books with unusual frequency. These seemingly minor disturbances, when performed by dozens of students simultaneously, could escalate into a sustained, low-level cacophony, making it impossible for the master to continue. Students might exchange knowing glances, a silent agreement passing between them to collectively make the master's life difficult. Some might even engage in subtle acts of insubordination, like turning their backs to the lecturer, or openly making exaggerated yawns and stretches. While this was not a formal ritual, The synchronized nature of these actions gave them a ritualistic quality, a collective performance of disrespect. More direct forms of mocking involved anonymous satirical verses or lampoons. These clever, often biting poems would ridicule a master's teaching style, their physical appearance, their perceived intellectual shortcomings, or even their moral failings. These verses would be circulated secretly among the students, passed from hand to hand in the common rooms or taverns. Sometimes they might be nailed to a college door overnight, discovered by a horrified master in the morning. The verses used wit and rhyme to undermine a master's authority, often eliciting widespread amusement and agreement among the student body. The anonymity protected the authors, allowing for a level of critique that would be unthinkable in a face-to-face confrontation. Public, albeit anonymous, display of these verses made the mocking a collective experience, a shared laugh at the expense of authority. Perhaps the most potent and organized form of student resistance, a truly significant counter-ritual, was the secession or student strike. This was not a mere walkout. It was a mass exodus. When students felt the university administration or town authorities were unjust, they would collectively decide to abandon their studies and leave the town entirely. This was a massive undertaking, involving hundreds, sometimes thousands of students. Records show significant secessions from universities like Paris and Oxford. The students would pack their meager belongings, often traveling together in large groups, sometimes even taking their masters with them, to found a new university elsewhere or to simply disperse until their demands were met. The decision to secede was often made after a series of escalating grievances, disputes over rents with landlords, violent clashes with townspeople where university privileges were ignored, or disagreements over academic fees, or the appointment of certain masters. The students would formally declare their intention to leave, effectively holding the university and the town hostage. For the university, a mass secession meant a catastrophic loss of revenue and prestige. For the town, it meant a sudden economic downturn, as students were major consumers of food, drink, and lodging. This collective departure was a powerful, dramatic ritual of protest, demonstrating the students' understanding of their economic and social power. The act of gathering their belongings, of marching out of the city gates in unison, was a performative act of defiance, a clear and undeniable message to the authorities. Sometimes, these secessions led to the founding of entirely new universities, as was arguably the case with Cambridge, which saw an influx of scholars from Oxford during periods of unrest. Instances of students physically confronting disliked masters, while less common and certainly more dangerous, also occurred. Accounts describe situations where a master, perhaps due to a particularly harsh disciplinary action or an unfair grading practice, would face the organized wrath of his students. This might involve a mob of students blocking his path, barraging him with insults, or even, in rare and extreme cases, physically assaulting him. These were acts of raw, unbridled defiance, far beyond a simple prank. But they still carried a ritualistic element in their collective and often premeditated nature. The students would act as one united in their resentment, creating a powerful, intimidating force. These acts of masters' mocking and organized resistance highlight a fascinating aspect of medieval university life. Despite the rigid hierarchy and the immense authority of the masters and university officials, students were not passive recipients of knowledge. They were a vibrant, often volatile community, with their own internal structures, their own sense of justice, and their own methods of making their voices heard. Their collective actions, ranging from subtle classroom disruptions to mass desertions, served as a powerful check on authority, forming a fascinating counterpoint to the more formal rituals of the university. Number 3. Feast or famine. The Mythigule Student Party. Step back into the bustling, sometimes chaotic world of a medieval university town, and you will quickly discover that student life was not just about dusty tomes and intense debates. It was also about feasting, revelry, and copious amounts of drink. These gatherings, ranging from mandatory ceremonial meals to spontaneous boisterous affairs, formed a crucial part of the social fabric of student life. However, these celebrations often followed a predictable trajectory, moving from structured merriment to drunken chaos, frequently spilling out into the streets and igniting the infamous town and gown clashes that characterized university existence. Feasts were a regular occurrence, marking significant milestones in a student's academic journey. There were admission feasts, celebrating a new student's entry into the university. There were celebratory meals when a student successfully completed a stage of their studies, or, most importantly, when they received a degree. Saints' days, religious holidays, and even the end of a particularly challenging examination period all provided excuses for gathering. These feasts were often mandatory for those who could afford them, with students expected to contribute financially to the communal table. For the poorer students, this often meant a significant burden, sometimes requiring them to beg for funds or food to meet their obligation. Imagine the scene: a large common hall in a college, or perhaps a rented room in a local tavern, filled with dozens, sometimes hundreds of students. The air would be thick with the smell of roasted meats, fresh bread, and most prominently, ale and wine. Tables, often long and sturdy, would be laden with trenchers of food. Depending on the wealth of the students and the occasion, the fare could range from simple bread and cheese to more lavish spreads of fowl, game, and various spiced dishes. The drinks, however, were almost always in abundance. Ale was the staple, brewed locally and consumed in vast quantities throughout the day, not just during feasts. Wine, often cheaper and more readily available than clean water, flowed freely. The initial hours of a feast would often be filled with lively conversation, storytelling, and singing. Students, many of them far from home and relatively young, would bond over shared experiences, academic frustrations, and the general peculiarities of university life. There might be recitations of poems, humorous orations, and even impromptu theatrical performances. The energy was high, the camaraderie strong. These gatherings served a vital social function, creating a sense of community and shared identity among a diverse group of young men from different regions and social classes. They were a pressure release valve for the intense intellectual demands of their studies and the sometimes harsh realities of medieval urban life. However, as the hours wore on and the pitchers of ale and barrels of wine emptied with increasing speed, the atmosphere often shifted. The structured revelry would gradually give way to a more uninhibited, sometimes boisterous chaos. Voices grew louder, laughter became more raucous, and arguments fueled by alcohol would frequently erupt. These might begin as academic debates that escalated into heated exchanges, or personal grudges that found their outlet in a drunken challenge. The sheer volume of alcohol consumed meant that inhibitions quickly faded and tempers flared easily. It was when these internal disputes, or the sheer exuberance of the intoxicated students, spilled out from the confines of the college or tavern into the town streets, that the true weirdness and danger of the medieval student party often emerged. The streets of university towns like Paris, Oxford, and Bologna were often crowded and tense. Students, many of them armed with daggers for self-defense or simply for show, frequently found themselves at odds with the local townspeople, the town to the students' gown. Disputes over prices in taverns, romantic rivalries, or simply the perceived arrogance of the students could quickly ignite into full-blown brawls. Imagine a group of drunken students flushed with wine and the confidence of numbers, stumbling through the narrow, unlit streets after a feast. They might begin to heckle passers-by, damage property, or engage in petty acts of vandalism. A single rude word or a shove could quickly escalate into a violent confrontation. Townspeople, who often resented the privileges and haughty demeanor of the students and who frequently suffered from their excesses, were often quick to retaliate. What started as a student party could thus transform into a violent riot, with students and townsfolk clashing with whatever weapons they could find: fists, stones, knives, staves, even bows and arrows. These town and gown riots were a recurring feature of medieval university life, and many of them began with student feasts and drinking bouts. The university authorities, with their own courts and a degree of immunity from local law, often struggled to control their rowdy scholars, sometimes even defending their students in disputes with townspeople, further fanning the flames of resentment. The students, in turn, often felt protected by their university's special status, which emboldened their behavior. So the medieval student party was a bizarre paradox, a social ritual essential for bonding and celebration, yet also a common catalyst for widespread disorder and violence. It was a cycle of communal feasting turning into individual excess, then transforming into collective mayhem. The hangovers that followed were likely immense, but the shared experience of the feast, and perhaps the brawl, cemented the bonds of student brotherhood, preparing them in a strange way for the next academic challenge or the next opportunity to raise a goblet. Number 4. The art of disputation. When arguments got physical. In the medieval university, the disputation was not just a mere argument. It was the very heartbeat of intellectual life, a high-stakes public performance where logic, rhetoric, and sheer intellectual endurance were put to the ultimate test. It was a ritualized form of academic combat, central to the learning process, yet often conducted with such intensity that it could and sometimes did spill over into physical confrontation. Forget the quiet, contemplative solitude of modern research. Medieval scholars proved their worth through a fierce and public battle of wits. Disputations took place regularly, often several times a week, and were of two main types: ordinary disputations, which were part of the regular curriculum, and extraordinary disputations, often held for special occasions like a student's progression to a higher degree. Students from the most junior scholars to those preparing for their master's examinations were expected to participate, first as respondents or opponents, and later as proposers. The whole university, or at least a significant portion of it, might gather to witness these intellectual duels. Imagine a large, often unheated lecture hall, or a dedicated disputation chamber. A master, serving as the moderator, would preside over the proceedings from a raised chair. Before them, a student, usually one presenting a thesis, would sit opposite an opponent, often another student or a junior master. The air would crackle with anticipation. The process began with the student proposing a thesis, a specific proposition or statement often drawn from a set text in theology, philosophy, or law. This thesis would be stated formally, often in Latin, and the student would briefly defend it. Then came the challenge. The opponent would rise and, using strict rules of Aristotelian logic, systematically attempt to refute the thesis. They would pose objections, often in the form of carefully constructed syllogisms, aiming to find contradictions or logical flaws in the proposer's statement. The proposer then had to respond to each objection, either by granting its premise but denying its conclusion, by distinguishing between different meanings of a term, or by outright refuting the objection. This was not a free-flowing debate. It was a highly structured, almost choreographic, exchange of logical propositions. The moderator, the master, would intervene to ensure adherence to the rules of logic and to guide the discussion, sometimes offering a nuanced resolution to a particularly tricky point. The weirdness of these disputations lay not just in their rigid structure or the dense Latin in which they were conducted, but in the sheer intensity of the verbal sparring. Students and masters were trained from their earliest days to think on their feet, to dissect arguments and to respond with swift, precise, logical counterpoints. The pressure was immense. Public failure in a disputation could damage a student's reputation. delay their academic progress, or even lead to ridicule. Conversely, a brilliant performance could elevate a student's standing and garner the admiration of their peers and masters. The audience, comprising other students and even townspeople drawn by the spectacle, would follow the arguments intently, sometimes murmuring their agreement or disagreement, or even openly expressing their reactions. The language used in disputations, while formal, could often become highly passionate. Accusations of faulty logic, intellectual laziness, or outright ignorance might be flung back and forth. The medieval intellectual world was fiercely competitive, and scholars were not shy about engaging in rhetorical flourishes that could feel like personal attacks. While the primary goal was to uncover truth through rigorous logical reasoning, the human element, with all its pride and ambition, was always present. It was during these intense intellectual battles that the potential for physical conflict sometimes emerged. While direct physical violence within the disputation itself was not condoned, the heated atmosphere, the high stakes, and the sometimes thinly veiled insults could easily spill over. Imagine a situation where a student felt personally attacked by an opponent's refutation, or where a master's judgment was perceived as unfair or biased. The verbal arguments, already charged with tension, could escalate. A student might throw a book down in disgust, shout an open insult, or even, in a moment of extreme frustration, lunge at their opponent. More commonly, the aggression manifested outside the immediate context of the debate. Rivalries formed during disputations could lead to brawls later in the day or evening, perhaps in a tavern or a narrow street. Students who felt their intellectual honor had been impugned might seek out their opponents, and what began as a logical argument would end in a fist fight or a dagger skirmish. These were often not isolated incidents, but part of the larger pattern of town and gown violence, where students, already a volatile group, might use the heightened emotions of a disputation as an excuse for broader unrest. Historical accounts from universities like Paris and Bologna describe situations where academic factions, often organized by nations or schools of thought, would become so deeply entrenched in their intellectual rivalries that these animosities would translate into physical clashes. A disputation on a controversial theological point could ignite passions that led to street brawls between supporters of opposing views. The art of disputation, therefore, was a double-edged sword, a powerful tool for intellectual development, but also a crucible that, under pressure, could transform scholarly argument into raw physical conflict. It was a reminder that even in the pursuit of pure knowledge, the human element of passion, pride, and sometimes violence was never far below the surface. Number 5. The jura. Swearing allegiance, or else. Imagine standing before a stern-faced rector or chancellor in a dimly lit hall, your hand raised, repeating ancient Latin phrases. Your voice, perhaps a little shaky, echoes in the silent chamber as you pledge unwavering loyalty to the university, its masters, and the very ground you stand upon. This was the ritual of the jura, the oath-swearing ceremony, a deeply ingrained and highly formal part of medieval university life. This was not a casual promise. It was a sacred bond, an allegiance that every student, upon admission and at various stages of their academic journey, was compelled to make. Refusal was not an option. From the moment a new student arrived, often a young man barely into his teens, this web of oaths began to entangle him. The university was an independent entity, a universitas, or corporation of scholars, often enjoying special privileges and autonomy from local civic or ecclesiastical authorities. To maintain its order, control its diverse and often unruly student population, and protect its unique status, the university relied heavily on formal oaths. These oaths were a binding contract in a world where formal legal frameworks were often less developed and less universally applied. The oaths were comprehensive. A student typically swore to uphold the university's statutes, a vast collection of rules governing everything from academic conduct to social behavior and even dress codes. They pledged obedience to the rector, the chief administrative officer, and to their masters, promising to attend lectures, participate in disputations, and generally conduct themselves in a manner befitting a scholar. But the oaths extended beyond the academic sphere. Students often swore to maintain peace with the townspeople, a particularly challenging pledge given the frequent town and gown skirmishes. They promised not to leave the university or the town without proper permission from the authorities. Some oaths even required students to report on the transgressions of their peers, creating a climate of both solidarity and potential suspicion. Imagine the atmosphere during such a ceremony. For many students, especially those from distant lands, the university was a strange new world. The formal setting, the solemn pronouncements in Latin, and the grave demeanor of the university officials would have emphasized the seriousness of the commitment they were undertaking. The student might be asked to place their hand upon a holy book, a Bible, or a collection of university statutes, further imbuing the oath with religious sanctity. In a deeply religious society, an oath sworn on holy texts was considered a promise made directly to God, and breaking it carried severe spiritual as well as temporal consequences. The specific wording of these oaths varied from university to university, but their essence remained the same: absolute submission to university authority and dedication to its rules. For example, records from the University of Paris describe oaths where students promised to defend the honor, utility, and peace of the university, and to report any harm or injury committed against. At Oxford, students swore not to conspire against the chancellor or proctors, and to accept their decisions. These were not vague pledges of good intent. They were precise, demanding statements of allegiance designed to ensure internal cohesion and control. The jura was not a one-time event. Students would often be required to renew their oaths at various stages of their academic progression. Upon entering a particular faculty, or when preparing for examinations for a higher degree, another set of pledges might be required. This continuous process reinforced the students' ongoing commitment and reminded them of their duties and obligations. It was a constant ritual of reaffirmation, designed to prevent complacency or defiance. And what happened if a student refused to swear the oath? The consequences were immediate, and severe refusal meant exclusion from the university entirely. Without the oath, a student could not matriculate, could not attend lectures, and could not participate in any academic life. It was a non-negotiable barrier to entry. For those who swore the oath but later broke its tenets, the punishments could range from fines and public humiliation to suspension, or in the most egregious cases, expulsion. As detailed in the previous ritual, expulsion was a public definitive act of banishment, effectively ending a scholar's aspirations. The oath-breaking student faced not only the loss of their academic career, but also the burden of a broken spiritual promise. The ritual of the jura was a cornerstone of medieval university governance. It represented the university's unique power as a self-governing body in a complex and often turbulent world. It created a powerful formal bond between the individual student and the institution, shaping their behavior and ensuring their compliance. It was a solemn, intimidating, and utterly essential ritual that defined the very relationship between the medieval scholar and the pursuit of knowledge. Number 6. Depositio cornutum, the dehorning of new students. Imagine yourself a fresh-faced, perhaps somewhat naive, young man arriving in a bustling, often overwhelming, medieval university town. You are eager to begin your studies, filled with a mix of excitement and apprehension. Before you can delve into the world of ancient texts and profound debates, you must first endure a peculiar and rather humiliating rite of passage, the depositio cornutum, or the dehorning of the horned beasts. This was no gentle welcome. It was a ritualized hazing, a symbolic transformation designed to strip away your rustic origins and initiate you into the academic world. The term cornutum literally means horned or horned beast, and it was the common medieval nickname for new students, particularly freshmen. The belief was that these newcomers were unrefined, uncouth, and still bore the metaphorical horns and tusks of their provincial, uncultured upbringing. They were seen as raw, untamed animals, needing to be civilized and polished before they could truly engage in the intellectual pursuits of the university. This ritual was prevalent across many European universities, particularly in German-speaking regions, but variations were found in Paris, Oxford, and Bologna. Upon arrival, new students, often referred to as bien, from biehunus, meaning yellow beak, referring to a fledgling bird, were usually targeted by older, more established students, known as scholarias majores or senior students. These seniors would take it upon themselves to oversee the depositio. The ceremony might take place in a student, lodging, a common hall, or even a local tavern. The atmosphere would be a strange mix of boisterous camaraderie from the older students and nervous anticipation from the newcomers. The ritual often began with a mock shaving. The beanie would be made to sit, sometimes blindfolded, while an older student, acting as a barber, would pretend to shave their face or head with a large, dull knife or a piece of wood. This was not a real shave, but the scraping noise and the sensation would be unsettling. This act symbolized the removal of the new student's uncivilized hair, marking their transition from the rough-hewn countryman to the smoother-faced scholar. The shaving cream might be something unpleasant, like stale beer dregs or a mixture of flour and water, designed to add to the discomfort and humiliation. The most symbolic part, and the origin of the ritual's name, was the dehorning. The older students would pretend to file down imaginary horns on the new student's forehead or temples. They would use rough stones, files, or even large blunt pieces of wood, scraping them against the student's head with an audible grinding noise. This was not meant to cause actual harm, but it was certainly meant to be uncomfortable, a tactile representation of shedding their beastly nature. Alongside this, some rituals included a mock tooth extraction, where the seniors would use large pliers or tongs to pretend to pull out the new student's teeth, symbolizing the removal of their tusks. Other elements of the depositio instrumenta, the tools of the depositio, included a washing or cleansing with foul water, sometimes from a chamber pot, to further purify the new student from their past impurities. They might be forced to wear animal skins or other ridiculous garments, emphasizing their former beastly state. Throughout the process, the new students would be subjected to a barrage of insults, jokes, and satirical pronouncements, often delivered in a mock academic tone. Senior students might read from a statute of the beanie, a humorous, often crude set of rules, detailing the new students' supposed ignorance and their low status. After enduring these physical and verbal indignities, the new student would finally be declared dehorned, civilized, and ready to be formally welcomed into the student body. The transformation was complete. There was one crucial final step, often the most tangible part for the senior students, the deposit or benus money. The newly civilized student was expected to pay a fee, either money, a quantity of food, or a significant amount of drink, to their initiators. This deposit would then be used to fund a celebratory feast for the senior students, solidifying the new students' place within the hierarchy and getting the older students a tangible reward for their efforts. This could be a significant financial burden for the new student, sometimes depleting their initial funds before they even began their studies. The depositio cornutum served multiple purposes. It was a rite of passage, marking the transition from outsider to insider. It instilled humility in the new students, making them shed their previous arrogance or provincial ways. It also served as a bonding experience, creating a shared memory of discomfort and eventual acceptance, which could later lead to strong camaraderie among the initiated. And perhaps most practically, it provided a source of funds and entertainment for the older students. This ritual, though seemingly bizarre and harsh to modern eyes, was a deeply embedded part of medieval university culture. It was a rough, often crude, but ultimately formative experience that helped shape the identity of the medieval scholar, preparing them for the rigors and sometimes the absurdities of academic life. The dehorned student, now officially civilized, would eventually become an older student themselves, ready to perpetuate the tradition upon the next generation of horned beasts.